Before we get started in this class really talking about moral theories, I want to talk about a few challenges to morality, a few challenges to ethics. Now, these challenges, I think, both challenge morality as we normally think of it and challenge sort of philosophical morality, theorizing about morality in the sense that I want to do it in this class. So I think it's worth talking about them, seeing if they really are challenges, because if they are, A, a lot of what we normally think about morality in our day-to-day lives is just going to be wrong. And B, what we're trying to do in this class would be impossible. Having said that, since the class doesn't stop after this week, you guys can probably guess that I think these challenges can be met or aren't as serious as they're often made out to be, but I think we should discuss them before we get into these issues. We shouldn't just ignore them, right? I also want to talk about this stuff and especially talk about it in connection with the two pieces I had you read from James Rachel's, because I think it's very good to teach argument to reinforce some of the things we went over in the first unit on the basics of argument. Rachel's is very good with this, breaking this down into arguments, asking if we can accept the arguments, looking at the logic of things. I think this is very good practice to sort of drive home the material we've already went over a bit more. In fact, I think Rachel's has a very nice textbook. It's one of my favorites when it comes to moral philosophy. You guys might be asking, okay, if you like it so much, why didn't you have us buy it? Why aren't we just reading that instead of, various things you put on the Canvas site? Well, it's a nice book, but his son, Rachel's died a few years ago, his son and the publisher keep, and I want to put this in scare quotes, updating it. And the updates tend to make the book worse. I actually think his son has not improved the book. Not only that, for all the updates, they keep jacking the price up. I did think about adopting this for the class. I think it was $70, maybe $90. At any rate, it's a good book. It's very nice. It's not $70 nice. I'd pay 20 for it maybe, right? If I'd pay 20 for it, I'm not going to ask you guys to pay 70. It's just outrageous. I don't know. If we're talking about moral claims, the stuff textbook publishers do is an outrage. I think that's a pretty safe moral claim. Okay. At any rate, let's get into cultural relativism. We'll talk about relativism first, then we'll talk about egoism after we finish that. And so the first thing we should do is just to ask, why is cultural relativism a challenge to morality? Well, think about the way you normally think about moral claims, right? If you say murder is wrong, or if you make any claim about something being wrong, you don't mean, oh, hey, we Americans, or we, people who live in Virginia Beach, or whatever. You don't mean, oh, I just think that this group of people I belong to thinks it's wrong, right? You are saying something a lot bigger. You're saying murder is wrong for everyone at all times, right? And cultural relativism says that you can't really say that, or you shouldn't, right? Cultural relativism says that all moral claims are in some way relative to a culture. Trust me, we'll talk more about what relativism is. I think Rachel's does a very nice job of laying this out, and I think we should think more about what we mean by it. But just for now, we'll just talk about relativism, then we'll dig more deeply into what it means. Relativism seems to say that moral claims are like claims of taste, right? We like hot food or we don't like hot food. Other people might feel differently about it. I actually really like it. You might not. But ultimately say that, moral claims are like claims of taste, right? Or we eat certain animals, other cultures don't. They eat animals we don't eat. We find that weird, maybe. Morality is the same way, right? That's a pretty shocking claim, right? And it's a pretty direct challenge to what we think about morality. So, why is it attractive, right? If it's such a challenging, if it's such a odd claim in so many ways, why is it challenging? Or sorry, why is it so attractive? I mean, part of this might just be, that we like surprising claims that grab our attention, right? A lot of media coverage is driven by this. Things that surprise people, things that are shocking, get attention. But I think there's more going on than that. I think there are real reasons that people find cultural relativism attractive. Um, I ultimately side with Rachel's. I don't think cultural relativism is right. But one of the few things I don't like about the Rachel's article is I don't think he gives cultural relativism really a fair shake, that he really digs deeply enough into what makes it attractive. And I'd like to say a little bit about that, right? Because even if we think cultural relativism is ultimately wrong, if so many people find it attractive, there's got to be a reason, right? You can't just assume people are stupid. There has to be something that seems attractive about this doctrine, something that makes it seem attractive or true. So why is cultural relativism attractive? I think there are a few reasons for this. One is just that it's an undeniable fact that different cultures do have different moral codes, at least in some sense, right? We'll talk about how we ought to think about that claim, how deeply the disagreement goes in a few lectures. But look, there are some moral claims that cultures seem to very much disagree on, right? Rachel's, one of the things I like about this article is he gives us some very nice examples of this, right? The Galatians and the Greeks, right? The Greeks think you should burn your dead. The Galatians think, oh, you should eat them, right? This seems very much a moral disagreement. What's the proper thing to do with your dead loved ones? Galatians say eat them. Greeks say cremate or burn them. Well, Galatians are just completely shocked and disgusted by this idea of burning your dead. The Greeks, probably siding with us, are just as shocked, just as disgusted with the idea of eating your dead, right? Other ones that Rachel's talks about, the Eskimo, well, these early travelers, when they first made contact, they, some of the stuff we might not find so shocking. I don't know, that they didn't have the sexual morality of the early European explorers, that marriage didn't mean what it meant to them. Your mileage might vary on that. There's a lot more variation in our own morality about sex than there was for the early Europeans who made contact, right? But some of this stuff, some of it you might still find shocking. I do a bit. But even if you don't find that stuff shocking, you think about how they treated the elderly, right? Or how they treated infants, specifically female infants, right? If somebody got too old to hunt when you reached a certain age, they would just leave them out to die of exposure to the cold weather, right? We argue in our society, we seem to reach a completely different judgment about the elderly. We argue about how generous Social Security should be. The Eskimo, well, they just leave you on the ice floe, right? Or think about infants, right? Well, we put this high value to life. We think you shouldn't just leave a baby to die. The Eskimo would do that. Not only would they do that, it seems the way they would do it, they put more value on male life than female life, right? If they had to leave a baby to die, they would choose the female babies, not the males, right? We, even more than the Europeans who first made contact with them, we probably think, oh, lives have equal values. This seems horribly sexist. These people have different morals than we do. Look, go read National Geographic for a bit, take an anthropology course, whatever. If if you want more evidence of this, it just seems safe to assume cultures don't agree about all their moral judgments, right? Moral codes differ. Another point here is it just seems arrogant or disrespectful to judge other cultures to be wrong. To say, oh, we're right about these moral matters, you guys are wrong. That seems horribly arrogant, right? And it's not just that it seems arrogant, oh, it's rude or whatever. These kind of judgments have led to some really nasty stuff, right? Think about colonialism. When the British or the Spanish or whoever conquered and enslaved groups of people, they would oftentimes try to, cast this as, oh, we're a superior culture, they're an inferior one. And, what's more, we're right about moral matters, they're wrong. So we're going to take over and we're going to make these people, we're going to bring them into our enlightened morality, right? I mean, when the English did this, when they conquered half the world, they would make claims about, their burden in civilizing these other people. Civilizing meaning, oh, we'll give them our more advanced moral codes, right? So judgments of cultural superiority do seem to justify some pretty terrible stuff, right? Colonialism, wars of conquest, things like that. If judgments of cultural superiority, moral superiority lead to that kind of stuff, well, maybe we should leave them in the past, right? Okay, so hopefully you guys have a better sense of why relativism is attractive. Because Rachel's is going to be very hard on relativism, and I'm going to follow him too. I don't think it's ultimately true. I don't think the arguments people give for it are very good ones when you look at them, and I think the arguments against are pretty compelling. But I do, before we get into that, want to give relativism a fair shake to see why it's attractive. Okay, so before criticizing relativism, before evaluating it, before we even really think about it, we ought to be clear on what we mean by cultural relativism. We use this term, but the term might mean different things. And not just that the term might mean different things, it might turn out that cultural relativism, in one sense of the term, is true, but relativism in other senses of the term are false. And Rachel's will actually, I think, at least say that, right? That some of these things that relativism, that we might mean by relativism, turn out to be true. Some might even have important messages for us, but other things might turn out to be false. Okay, so let's just go through the different things. I just literally cut and pasted this from the reading, but it's worth going through them again. So what do we mean by cultural relativism? Rachel's gives us 6 different possible things we might mean. Different societies have different moral codes, number 1. Number 2, there is no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code better than another. Number 3, the moral code of our own society has no special status. It is merely one among many. 4, there is no universal truth in ethics. That is, there are no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. 5, the moral code of a society determines what is right within that society. That is, if the moral code of a society says that a certain action is right, then that action is right at least within that society. 6, it is mere arrogance for us to try to judge the conduct of other peoples. We should adopt an attitude of tolerance toward the practices of other cultures. Now, because relativism might mean different things, because it in fact does seem to mean different things, we have to watch out for the fallacy of equivocation. I didn't mention this in the lectures on logic. Vaughan talks about it in your reading. He goes over it pretty quickly. But equivocation means that we kind of fail to pay attention to the fact that words and phrases have multiple meanings. Equivocation, you go from the fact that something is true of a word or a phrase or a concept in one sense and infer it's true of it in another. So I can't remember if I stole this from Vaughn or if I cribbed it from somebody else. I didn't think I'd come up with this. Here's an example of equivocation. So, spam is better than nothing. Nothing is better than lobster. So spam is better than lobster, right? We look at this, if you don't like lobster, replace it with something else. Most people do. I know some people who are disgusted at the idea. Replace it with steak or something, right? The point is, this is not a good argument, right? Why? Well, we use the term nothing in two completely different senses in 1 and 2, right? In 1, nothing just means, well, spam is better than having nothing at all, right? In 2, nothing means, well, there's no food, there's nothing that is in fact better than lobster, right? We use the same term, we use nothing, but it means different things in 1 and 2, right? Obviously, this is dumb. Nobody's going to fall for this argument. But when we look at something like relativism, and it has all these different senses, well, we do have to be careful because people might, carelessly go from the fact that relativism is true in one sense to think that it's true in other senses that it's not, right? Anyway, I think one of the things that might happen with relativism is we might muddle these senses up and go from the fact, well, it's true in one to assume it's true in others, right? Now, let's think a bit more about these senses of the term. Rachel's is mostly interested, when he's criticizing relativism, in criticizing, I think, 2 and 4. There's no objective standard that can be used to judge one societal code better than another. 4, there's no universal truths in ethics, no moral truths that hold for all people at all times. Moral claims are just matters of opinion that vary from culture to culture. Now, we'll look at the others later, but one thing I want you guys to notice, we've already seen this in the first few slides. We see this from the cases that Rachel thinks about. Relativism in sense 1 seems to be true. Different societies do have different moral codes. Well, that can be the case without these other senses of relativism being in any way true. But let's ask ourselves, does the truth of relativism in sense 1, does it give us a good argument for accepting relativism in, say, sense 4? I'm going to focus on that because I think that's the most important. Let's look at an argument that tries to go from relativism in sense 1 to sense 4. Remember our talk about valid arguments, premises. If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Well, is this a valid argument? Different cultures have different moral codes. Therefore, there is no objective truth or morality. Right and wrong are only opinions, and opinions vary from culture to culture. Could the premise, we only have one, be true and the conclusion false? Could different cultures disagree about morality and there still be some kind of objective truth and morality? I think it's pretty clear that they could, right? In fact, this is pretty obviously not a valid argument because premise 1 and 2 just talk about different things, right? Premise 1 talks about the fact that different cultures have different moral codes. Premise 2 talks about objective truth, right? Nothing at all in premise 1 about objective truth. Conclusion, claim 2 talks a lot about objective truth. There's obviously a huge jump here. 1 could be true and 2 false. Now look, what I think is actually worth doing is maybe trying to, Rachel's doesn't really do this. He just says, well, look, it's not a valid argument, moving right along, right? But I think it's worth filling in the missing premises here, trying to make this a valid argument and see if it works, right? Remember, the very least an argument needs to be valid, but once we have a valid argument, we need to ask if it's cogent, right? Valid, is it the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well? Cogent, do we accept the premises? And so look, I think once we fill these in, we can fill in a couple premises and make this a valid argument, but we can't make it a cogent argument, right? Different cultures have different moral codes, premise 1. Premise 2, so there is disagreement between cultures about morality. 3, if there is disagreement between cultures about some issue, there is no objective truth about that issue. Therefore, there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. Well, look, notice we filled in premises 2 and 3. They weren't there before. I think having done this, if this is a valid argument, but is it cogent? Do we accept these premises? Well, 2 just seems to be a consequence of 1. 2 just seems to be drawing out what 1 says, so maybe, right? We'll come back to this when we talk about just how much disagreement there is between cultures, but 2 doesn't seem that suspect. What about 3? If there is disagreement between cultures about some issue, there is no objective truth about that issue. Is that premise true? Should we accept it? I think when we think about it a little more, we can see that this premise is pretty obviously false and we shouldn't accept it. So, because the argument depends on a false premise, premise 3, it's not a cogent argument, not a good argument. Okay, so you guys are probably saying, well, why think that premise 3 is silly? Why think we should reject it, right? Well, Rachel's actually talks about this. He doesn't sketch the argument out, but I think it is worth sketching the argument out. Here's why I think we should reject premise 3. Because premise 3, if we accept it, would commit us to some claims that we know are wrong. So think about this, right? If there is disagreement between cultures about some issue, there is no objective truth about that issue. Premise 1 in this new argument, premise 3 in the old one. It's just our principle from the last argument. 2, different cultures disagree about whether the earth is round or flat. That's pretty clearly true. You can find some cultures, that still don't believe this, but especially if you look at historical cultures, the ancient Norse believed that the earth was a flat disk with ice around the edges, right? Interestingly enough, the Greeks actually knew that the earth was round way, way back. The idea the earth was flat was not something that everybody believed for a while. But pretty ingenious how the Greeks figured it out, but I won't delve into that. Just enough to know that different cultures disagree about whether the earth is round or flat, right? Therefore, there is no objective truth about whether the earth is round or flat. Claims about whether the earth is round or flat are only matters of opinions, and opinions vary from culture to culture. Obviously, that's crazy, right? I mean, there are some people out there who believe the earth is flat, right? There are flat earthers. One of these days, if I keep teaching long enough, I'm sure I'll have a flat earther in my class, and he or she will be angry at me, but whatever. I've had people in my classes who have friends who are flat earthers who are very frustrated by it. Never any flat earthers. I'm sure sooner or later it will happen. But anyway, even if you are a flat earther, you think there's some matter of fact about whether the earth is round or flat, right? You just wrongly think the earth is flat, right? No one thinks that this is a matter of opinion, even those weird people who think it's flat, right? The idea that this is just a matter of opinion is crazy. And so what we've seen is, if we were to accept premise 3, which I've recast here as number 1, then it would have just crazy or absurd results. And that gives us reason to reject, to see that premise 3 is false. Now, I think it's worth talking about this because in next lecture, we're going to talk about Rachel's arguments against relativism. And he's going to use this strategy pretty commonly. And the strategy Rachel's uses, you'll often hear philosophers talk about reductio arguments or reductio ad absurdum. If you take math classes, this will also sometimes pop up in mathematical proofs. But philosophers use it a lot. And the idea is this. It's the same basic principle as a counterexample, right? Counterexample, you just show, well, your theory says X is false, right? Reductio arguments are a little more complicated. You do a little more work, but the idea is the same. You show that if true, some principle or claim has a result that we know to be false, that we couldn't accept. Show that if it's true, it commits us to something absurd. That is, something we know to be false or even ridiculous. In this case, what it commits us to that's false or ridiculous, premise 1, is this idea that the earth, it's a matter of opinion whether the earth is round or flat, right? You can plug in a lot of other stuff. You can run a lot of reductio arguments with 1, but the idea is if we commit ourselves to it, it would have stupid results that we can't accept, so we should reject the principle. We'll talk a lot more about this. Rachel's will use this strategy a lot more in his arguments against relativism. For the time being, I just want you guys to be clear how it works. If you remember our lectures on logic, you can remember what valid argument form this whole thing uses, right? Remember modus tollens, if A, then B, not B, so not A. Well, that's just what reductio arguments use, right? If this principle were true, or this claim were true, this other crazy thing would be true as well. This other crazy thing isn't true, so we have to reject the principle or claim. All right. Anyway, sorry to kind of beat that horse, but I do just want to relate this back to the stuff we looked at in logic. We'll be talking a lot more about logic and argument, so I think it's good to kind of reinforce it now and to be clear on some of the strategies we'll be using with arguments. Okay, final thing I want to talk about is one more argument for relativism. Rachel's doesn't really sketch this one, but I think it's in the back of a lot of people's heads, right? This kind of goes back to this idea that, well, a lot of things that are terrible have been justified by claims of moral superiority. So the thought here is, well, look, toleration, being tolerant of other cultures is good. There's some kind of link between relativism, cultural relativism, and tolerance. So the argument goes like this. Believing that relativism is true would make us more tolerant. It would be good if we were more tolerant, so relativism is true. Is this a valid argument? Think about it for a second. Is this valid or not? Could these premises be true and the conclusion false? Well, now, some of you probably already see the answer to this, but if you don't, I think one thing that might be helpful here is to think about whether an argument with a very similar form would be a valid one, right? So let's replace relativism and toleration with some other stuff, right? Um, let's say believing that evil is always punished and good is always rewarded in this life would make us nicer people. It would be good if we were nicer people, so it's true that good is always rewarded in this life and evil is always punished, right? Well, obviously, that doesn't make that true, right? It might be good for us to believe those things. We might behave better if we believe them, but there's a difference between believing it's true makes you behave better and it actually being true, right? I might behave better, we all might behave better if we thought that we'd be rewarded for being good people and punished for being bad. That doesn't make that true, right? Now, I don't even know if premise one is true. I'm not sure that believing relativism is true would make us more tolerant. But even if it would, and even if it's true that it would be good to be more tolerant, that doesn't mean relativism is true, right? Premise one and premise two don't talk about relativism being true. They just talk about what it would be good for us to believe. And the fact that the conclusion, number three here kind of changes the subject, is a very good sign this is not a valid argument. For this argument to be valid, we need some premises somewhere that talk about truth. We don't see that in one or two, right? All right, final slide, just summing that up. Argument obviously not valid. Might even be the case that the premises are false. When I go over this argument in in-person classes, a lot of my students will push back on one. They'll say, well, I'm not even so sure that being relativists would make us more tolerant. They might be right about that. But even if one is true, it doesn't matter because this is not a valid argument. Okay, so what I think this has shown is the arguments often given for relativism, they look like this argument from the fact of relativism, in the sense of number one to number four, or they make some claim about it being good to be relativist because we'd be more tolerant. Those types of arguments aren't valid, or even if we try to make them valid, they're not cogent. So the common arguments for relativism, I think, turn out not to be great ones. Next lecture, we'll look at Rachel's positive arguments against relativism.